Hi everyone. So this is an overview of the actual visual side of this. So this is a little demo app, and you can see here we have a recipe card, then we have actual ingredients. So these are the line items. We have the actual ingredients, and then anything with a chevron is a sub recipe here. So if I click on this, we just lazy loaded all of these sub items. You'll notice here these are all ingredients, and then here we have another sub recipe. If I click on that, again, that lazy loaded. And just to see kind of what this actually looks like, let's jump over to the network tab in Fulcro, and I'm going to clear the network, and I'm going to fire this off one more time here, and you'll see this is what actually came through. So if we look at this and inspect it, you'll see that we're doing two things here. We're getting all the main top level stuff we need, name, ID, description, and then we're also grabbing this line items through a join, and we're also grabbing ingredient line items. And this denotes in the database the difference between sub recipes and actual leaf nodes. All right, so looking at this in code, let's actually jump over to the code now. And if we look at this here, this is the actual recipe card up here. So sorry, this is the outermost container that loads the client information. So this idea here is, you load in a bunch of clients, they have recipe cards, you can mark them as approved, you can then swap back, and in this case I'll mark it back as pending so we can look at it here, and that's the idea. So this loads this entire concept of multiple recipes per client. So this is where we do this kind of front load. And here's where we, in our client, in our query, this is where we're grabbing the query from the recipe card. So this is the actual card that we saw before. And I'm just going to scroll down here, and you'll see that we're doing a couple things, right? Here's where we're just marking some things as pending or approved. And then here is where we actually render the line items. So let's jump into this recipe line items.sc. And here you'll notice that in this query, we're doing this leaf or node. So this is where we're doing this dynamic kind of decision making on how and what we're loading and how to parse it and then what to load next. So this is kind of a key piece here just to look at for a minute. And you notice here the ident, right? This is where we're actually checking the properties on the incoming data on the props and seeing what's available. And if it has a recipe, if it has this key, this fully qualified key here of recipe line items ID, we know that it's a sub recipe. And then this is what we actually if we're looking here, right, we check and we switch, and this is what we'll add as the ident. Otherwise, we'll create a ingredient line items ID. And again, this is what's normalized in the client-side database. So just jumping over to that, right, just to give a little context here, this is the normalized database for ingredient line items, and this is the one for recipe line items. So if we just kind of dig into this for a second here, we can see we have a ID, and again, this is a little bit of the tables in the database are pluralized, so that's why this would probably make more sense as ingredient line item / ID, but just keep that in mind. All right, so let's switch back over to the code, and let's follow this path here of if we're rendering if it's a recipe line item, if it's a sub recipe, essentially. So coming up here, this is the component responsible for rendering the actual sub recipe. And again, the naming on this probably would have been better as a sub recipe line item, but this is just an artifact of the way that this was built. So the key thing to draw your attention to here is we have this query for this child recipe query, which we'll get to in a second. And this is where the lazy loading happens. So as they click on this to expand, we fire off this mutation here. Let's just inspect that for a second. And we're just loading it, and we're passing in the top level recipe card as all of the stuff that needs to happen in Fulcro over the wire. All right, so now let's look at what's actually getting the dynamic portion of this. So if we notice, if we tried to create a recursive query here, if we kept calling this get query, at some point we'd run into infinite recursion. So this is where this element comes in, which is this child recipe, and this is where we use a hook. And I want to draw your attention to a couple things here, but this is essentially where we kind of reset in a way. We rehook back up to the transaction system and Fulcro's goodness, and we lazy load everything. And the way that happens again is this gets reloaded, mounted, and then all the query happens again. The UI renders actually what was just loaded when we expanded and used the load mutation. All right, so I want to draw your attention to this initial params. And if we jump back now into the recipe line items, this is again where we start from the top. I want to also draw your attention to this initial state. And these two are important. If these are not included, then the initial setup of recipe line items doesn't work correctly. And there will be a more in-depth explanation as to why that is.